Welcome to the Hatcher Empowerment Factor with sisters and attorneys Reagan, Rachelle, and Renee Hatcher. Get ready to discuss the news, views, and issues that matter to our community. You're invited to call in at 219-885-1371. And remember, the views and opinions expressed on the Hatcher Empowerment Factor are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station. And now, the Hatcher Empowerment Factor.
Good morning, I'm Reagan Hatcher and welcome to the Hatcher Empowerment Factor. I'm joined this morning by my sisters and co-hosts, Rachelle Hatcher and Renee Hatcher.
We are so excited for this show to kick off, I must tell you. We are very excited. We will be here every week. We hope that this show will give a chance for us to engage many of you in the current issues of the day and a lot of the problems that we see going on in the state and in the country. So we'll be back here every single week, me and my sisters as well as my co-hosts, and talking about different issues. We hope that you will call in. We're very excited. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the 50 years after the Mississippi Freedom Summer, as well as the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But first, what we wanted to do is just give a brief introduction to ourselves and kind of some of our experiences in our work. So my name's Renee Hatcher. I am an attorney. I've been an attorney for the last 3 years, and my practice is primarily civil rights and community development law. We are all natives of Gary, and I'll leave it to my sisters to introduce themselves a little bit, and we'll jump into the show.
This is Rachelle Hatcher. I'm very excited to be here. Looking forward to speaking to the citizens of Gary and anyone else who might want to call in. Looking forward to hearing from you all and getting to talk about some serious issues with you all. I'm an attorney also. I'm currently working as a public defender, and I can't wait to get to the issues.
And I, again, am Reagan Hatcher. I've been an attorney since 2003. I've worked mainly for governmental entities, including the Gary Community School Corporation, the Calumet Township Trustee, and also the Lake County Deputy Prosecutor's Office. I think we're going to get right into the issues. What do you all think?
I think we should do it.
All right, so first, Renee, I think maybe you could tell us a little bit about the 50-year anniversary of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. I know that you had an opportunity to go down to Mississippi for the anniversary, and maybe you can give us a little background into what it was and what it did for the people in the United States.
Yeah, it was a great experience. So about 2 weeks ago, I had a chance to go down to Jackson, Mississippi. And really, it was nostalgic in a way, even though that was my first time in Jackson and the state of Mississippi. But really, I felt like there was so much history that I had a chance to really witness, living history. In 1964, there was the Mississippi Freedom Summer, which was organized by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as COFO, which was another kind of partner organization on that project. But really, the Mississippi Freedom Summer was amazing. There hasn't been anything quite like it since that time. And what it was that there was a call for volunteers from across the country to come down to Mississippi who had been experiencing a lot of issues around voter suppression, around voter intimidation, around really just allowing individuals who had the right to vote to actually exercise that right. They still had things that were common in Mississippi, such as the poll tax, grandfather clauses, literacy tests. These were all obstacles and barriers that were put in place so individuals, specifically black individuals, were unable to vote. And so SNCC decided that they needed to do something about it. In 1963, leading up to the Mississippi Freedom Summer, they actually had what was referred to as the Freedom Vote. And it was a really a mock election amongst the black population in the state of Mississippi to show that there were black voters who wanted to vote, who would come out, who were engaged and wanted to be engaged in the political process. And so that was a huge project within itself. But in 1964, they started the planning in sometime in that February, and really it's seen as a brainchild of people like Ella Baker, who was really a huge part and influence of SNCC, people like Bob Moses, who was the field secretary at the time, and they had thousands and thousands of volunteers who were coming from college campuses down for the summer to help voters register. A lot of times they were working in very rural, isolated places. People had to walk miles just to get to the polling place. But it was really an amazing project that happened throughout the state, volunteers working with those who were already in Mississippi who were taking really a risk. They were risking their lives just by exercising their right to vote.
Renee, and I understand a lot of volunteers were sent down by the NAACP that came down to help to monitor that election and make sure things went well.
Yeah, so the NAACP was also a partner organization in that. But so this was the 50th year in commemoration of the Freedom Summer, and so I had a chance to go down to Jackson, and it was really a convening of those who were involved in the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And one of those individuals was actually our father, believe it or not. He went down to Mississippi in 1964 briefly for the Freedom Summer, and then actually came back in 1965 when they were calling specifically for lawyer volunteers to try to desegregate public facilities. So there were a lot of cases that they were trying to mount against the state of Mississippi. There were still segregated libraries. You know, if you to apply for a library card, your grandfather or your father actually had to have a library card for them to even let you apply. You know, so they were preventing people from accessing public resources, which they had the right to access. You know, taking pictures of the colored-only signs down in Mississippi in almost every single public facility. So Dad was down there in 1965, and he was a large part of putting some of those cases together. So I had a chance to go down, and really I felt like I was following in his footsteps. And it was just a great experience in witnessing living history.
Well, Renee, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and see if we have any questions and more discussion about the 1964 Freedom Summer.
You're listening to the Hatcher Empowerment Factor. Call in your questions and comments at 219-885-1371. That's 219-885-1371. Don't touch that dial. This is the hottest radio show on the airwaves, the Hatcher Empowerment Factor. We'll be back in a moment.
Okay, and we're back. Great. And Rachel, I know that you had an opportunity to talk to Renee and Dad about that whole experience, and you were talking about some civil rights cases and some issues that came out of that Freedom Summer in 1964.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't get to go down with them this year. But before we move on to that, I think we should just go back a little bit and talk about how dangerous it really was during that summer. And of course, there were the 3 volunteers who went missing early on in that summer. So Renee, can you kind of fill people in on about the situation and how dangerous it actually was for people to go down and volunteer?
Yeah, absolutely. And this in large part was a credit, and also I think probably indicative of how serious and how dire the situation was, right, in Mississippi. Bob Moses has this famous quote. It says, when you're in Mississippi, it seems like the rest of the world doesn't exist. And when you're in the rest of the world, it seems like Mississippi can't exist. So Mississippi really was seen as one of the most oppressive, most racial prejudiced states at the time, and places in the country in terms of racial discrimination and oppression. So, you know, prior to a lot of the volunteers arriving, there were actually 3 volunteers that went missing down in Mississippi. And so they were trying to track down these volunteers who were sent to a very particular rural part of the state. And what comes back, and they end up finding out, is that several weeks later, they were killed. They were brutally murdered. They were buried. Their car was set on fire. And so this becomes a national kind of emergency right away. What you also have to remember is that a lot of the volunteers were white college students from the North, from New England, whose parents were very well-to-do, who were middle class. And so really the media grabbed onto the situation then. And a lot of the volunteers had even yet to arrive at that point, and seeing that some individuals had already lost their lives to what they were trying to accomplish, and were still willing to go.
And we were talking earlier about how the 1964 Civil Rights Act was actually implemented, and the issues that were going on during that time, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson taking over as the President of the United States, how do you think the Freedom Summer factored into getting the 1964 Civil Rights Act signed into legislation?
It absolutely had a huge impact, because really it shined a light on what was happening in the real world, right? And in terms of essentially blacks not having access not only to the ballot, but to any type of protection from the police. And so the Civil Rights Act then is signed later that year, and it certainly would not have come about if there wasn't the level of organizing, the level of determination from so many around the country, so many people who were beaten, who were sent to the hospital. They had they basically had a policy where in any situation where someone in SNCC or who was volunteering in Mississippi was sent to the hospital or they were jailed, then they would send 2 more volunteers in their place.
Okay.
And so just imagine that, knowing that you're putting your body in harm's way, but being so determined to overcome a lot of what they were facing at the time.
And I think that's what's so important about that Freedom Summer is the fact that those volunteers went missing early on, and people still came to Mississippi, and from all over the country, all kinds of different people came together to make a difference. They were dedicated, and they weren't going to give up, and they weren't deterred by the violence. So I think that's a beautiful thing, and it was a great summer, and I wish I could have been there.
Well, let's get into the legislation that came out of it. We have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Act, and at that time, as we know, President Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson took over. There's a lot of books that discuss the fact that if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, maybe if MLK would not have been assassinated, maybe the 1964 Civil Rights Act wouldn't have been signed into legislation. What do you all think about that?
I think that is certainly something. There's certainly something to be said for the reaction and kind of the mounting pressure around how and the context in which those 2 pieces of legislation were passed, right? But at the same time, the legislation still wasn't enough. People continued to organize, people continued to experience racial discrimination, to experience Jim Crow. Again, I think it's important, but it wasn't the end-all be-all goal of what they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah,
and actually going into it not being enough, President Johnson, after signing the Voting Rights Act, he said that the laws were not enough and that more needed to be done. And so he actually put in an executive order putting affirmative action into all federal contracts and employment. And that was the first federal action ever taken for affirmative action.
And that led us into the affirmative action period where there were so many African Americans that at least needed to be applicants for those kind of government positions. So, and when that came in, it came about after the Freedom Summer was over, then we had all these new things happening. Just one to mention, since we are recording this show in Gary, is the election of the first African American mayor, along with Carl Stokes in Cleveland, Ohio. But I think the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Freedom Summer, the attitude of Lyndon B. Johnson at the time probably propelled that forward in the country.
And I think it speaks to kind of where we are right now, right, today. So we need not only protection of the law, we need not to be discriminated against in employment, we need to be able to access the ballot, but we also need to figure out ways to create opportunities that we've historically been shut out of. And in large part, I think Johnson's executive order was a part of that, and basically signaling that we actually have to create opportunities for people who have historically and systematically been shut out of economic opportunities, right?
Absolutely, and this is a big issue in Michigan right now. They've been struggling with the affirmative action debate for some time. So I think we should maybe talk about what's going on in Michigan.
Okay, I think that's a great idea. Let's get into the actual Supreme Court decision that happened in Michigan, and maybe we'll talk about it a little, and then we'll come back with some more after the break. But why don't you give us a great introduction?
This is the hottest radio show on the airwaves, the Hatcher Empowerment Factor. We'll be back in a moment.
Okay, and we're we're back with the introduction to the Michigan case.
Okay, so the case in Michigan, well, first I should give a little bit of background. So Michigan had been using an affirmative action policy in its public state universities.
Okay.
They've been doing that for a while, but then in 2003 there was a lawsuit brought that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that that the universities couldn't have quotas for minorities when they're going through the application process.
Now, I'm thinking it wasn't a minority student that brought this lawsuit.
It never is.
No, it was not.
Okay.
No, yeah, but that was the Gratz and Grutter case, right, Jill?
Yes.
So Gratz and Grutter, essentially two Supreme Court cases that were ultimately kind of consolidated, saying that you can't use racial quotas, but it can be a factor in admission policies for state universities.
And I guess this was a white student who brought it because they were not allowed into the university?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they weren't admitted. And so Renee's right. The Supreme Court said that race could be used as a factor, as a plus factor, when admissions decisions are being made.
Okay.
So after that, the state of Michigan amended its constitution to ban public universities from using race as a factor in admissions processes in public universities.
Mm-hmm.
There was a challenge brought to that state constitutional amendment, and it just came down from the Supreme Court again, and now the Supreme Court has basically said that Michigan can do that they can place a ban on using race as a factor in public universities.
So in essence, what they're doing is beginning to break down slowly and systematically the affirmative action law that was kind of put into place by Lyndon Johnson way back in 1964.
Yeah, and let's just put this in context, right? So what we're really talking about is affirmative action policies. Sometimes now are cloaked as diversity policies that really have nothing to do with affirmative action anymore. Mm-hmm. But they have slowly eroded any type of affirmative action program. But why this case in particular is damaging is because it could potentially extend to all types of government decisions. You see the state of California doing something similar several years ago. And what really happens, and the way this happens, is that conservative groups organize around getting a ballot initiative to ban the use of race in whether it be admission policies or
and that's those questions on the ballot that you may have at the end after you make your selections for voting.
Right, absolutely. Like, so some states have ballot initiatives with every election that they may have, and essentially they ask you a question, you vote up or down, and then they either enact some type of statute or sometimes a state amendment as a result of that ballot initiative. So that's what happened in Michigan. And essentially, this is damaging because the Supreme Court has now said that you can absolutely do that you can ban any type of racial affirmative action policies in the application procedure for state schools.
Now, a lot of people would say that even though in 1964 Lyndon B. Johnson kind of gave this proclamation that it be implemented, that we haven't seen a lot of progress in it in the last 50 years. So why does it matter if it's taken out or put in?
Well, you know, it plays both ways, right? But so in terms of affirmative action, it can mean a lot of different things now, especially when you're talking about admission policies. So athletes, for example, receive some type of affirmative action. If you're a legacy student and someone in your family attended that school, they receive some type of consideration for that. And the Supreme Court has only struck down any type of affirmative action consideration when it applies to race. Mm-hmm. So everything else stands as is. So I think it's problematic because of that, but I think it also signals the fact that courts and the judiciary branch of government used to be an ally of progress of the Black freedom movement or the freedom movement period in this country. And now we see them case after case and term after term, not just from the Supreme Court, but a lot of the federal courts around this country. We see them basically putting forth decisions that are actually going to move us backwards.
Now, Rachel, we were talking about this earlier, and you were talking about how the Supreme Court decisions have consistently, instead of propelling us forward and following that mindset of Lyndon B. Johnson and the presidents like Jimmy Carter that came after him, we're actually moving backwards because of the Supreme Court decisions.
That's true. It's unfortunate because we're starting to, it limits access to things for people of color. And, you know, the court kind of has the attitude that, well, things are okay today, so we don't have to have these kind of policies, and that's just clearly not the case.
Well, guys, I think we have a caller on the line. We're going to take one call right now. Caller, you're on the air.
Hello, good morning, good morning. What a great day this is today to be talking to you with this Hatcher report, and I guess that's what I wanted to get to, the fact that you three having grown up in a family that dealt with a number of the issues that you're talking about. Why is it you feel, I mean, that we're not getting the same kind of results that we did, say, back when your father, Richard Hatcher, was on the battle lines and doing things? Have the tactics changed, or what's the situation of why we're not getting as many results these days?
And that's a great question. I think what's happened is, especially with the election of President Barack Obama, I mean, we know that that was a major victory for African Americans in the United States. However, back in 1964, things were so rugged and raw. Do you guys agree? You know, people were out there, they were fighting, they were working. They didn't have any opportunity to have the same abilities and opportunities as their white counterparts did. And so there was a real fight. But now, as we continue, and I think it slowed down after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You guys think so? Especially after 1968.
I would say probably sometime in the 70s, really. But I think you're right on point in saying that it's this whole idea of that we're now a post-racial society, right? With the election of the first African American president, that
like
we're in a post-racial,
okay.
Right? We have removed all of the legal barriers or all the laws and essentially done everything that we need to do, and now we're in a post-racial society. And unfortunately, a lot of people buy into that, although we know it's different. And so I think that it's the difference between fighting things that are very obvious and open and trying to also resist against institutional racism, which now we experience in different types of ways, and it's sometimes difficult to articulate, and it's also difficult to organize people around. And I think that we know it all exists. It's kind of one of those gut things, but some people are not sure as to how to move forward to really combat it.
Don't touch that dial. This is the hottest radio show on the airwaves, the Hatcher Empowerment Factor. We'll be back in a moment.
Okay, and we're back. We ended the break talking about workers' rights, wages, benefits, and caller audio with a Supreme Court decision that discussed pension benefits for those same workers. And we were talking about how in the 1972 convention, how a lot of those issues were brought to the forefront, and how those persons that came from all across the country to discuss being elected in their community were pushing for these union rights.
Absolutely, and that's something that I think a lot of people lose sight of, is that back in the 60s, it wasn't just about civil rights, it was also about jobs. A big part of the push was about access to gainful employment for people of color.
Okay, we have a caller. Let's take that caller. Caller, you're on there.
Yes, I want to say hello to the young ladies.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I'm out here on the fishing bank. I can't catch fish out here because I'm too interested in the show today.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Something for the city of Gary. I think it's a wonderful show, and please keep up good work.
Thank you.
so much.
We appreciate the call.
Yeah, just to your point, Shell, you know, the 1963 March on Washington was the march for freedom and jobs. And a lot of people leave off that,
right,
because a large part,
jobs.
you know, the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter how many black elected officials you have or minority candidates you have. That doesn't matter if we don't start thinking about the economic implications and workers' rights. And part of what people, I think, have to consider is that really what we're talking about when we're talking about workers' rights is how we want to organize ourselves and how we want people to be able to live in terms of their quality of life. And so at a very basic level, we have to have collective bargaining rights. We see that there were dangerous working conditions even before unions started. You know, a lot of times workers were seen as dispensable, really, because because of the harsh and hazardous working conditions, and a large part of that is also environmental concerns as well. But I think we have another caller.
Yeah, caller, you're on the air.
Oh, he dropped.
Uh-oh, we lost him?
That's okay, we'll get him back. But yeah, the working conditions was one of the biggest issues that unions were established. Not necessarily, I mean, of course, wages as well, but working conditions and workers dying on the job without any type of help to the families afterwards was a big issue back then.
And I think one of the positive thing that's going on in the country right now is that there are a number of major cities and mayors of major cities that are looking at raising the living wage, or the minimum wage, I'm sorry, because we cannot get this Congress to do anything. They're sitting on their hands. They don't want to raise the...
That's a whole show, Renee.
Right.
Itself. Don't even start.
We know that the minimum wage has stagnated even in the midst of inflation, but there are a number of cities, including New York and now currently Chicago. There's a lot of people pitching in Chicago to raise the minimum wage.
We have that caller back on the line. I think, caller, you're on the air.
Yes. Good morning, ladies. Hey, fresh air.
Well, thank you.
Hey, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. The struggle continues. You know what? What are we going to call it? Last guy called in and mentioned something about fishing. It's the only city in the United States on the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence Seaway system, without a public access fishing spot.
Yeah.
And it's a sore spot to this. I just can't understand that I got $3 million for this city, and the city of Gary took the money and spent it on getting the casinos here, and refused to let the public out there, told me I could come out here. And before we spent $28 million on the Marquette plant, the United States Fish and Wildlife Services told Mayor Carrie Wilson not to do it, to talk with me before she did it. Yet she wouldn't spend the money anyhow. Why do we treat each other so bad?
Again, that's another show within itself. But I think that's what we were kind of talking about before, about how cities like Gary, cities like Detroit, like Cleveland, those kind of cities, they have to have new industries to continue to propel their city forward. And the fishing industry and the boating industry in Gary would be a big boost to our economy. We have people now who kind of go off that ramp on Lake Street, but just think if we had a dock, just think if we had a marina, just think if we had actual fishing port where boats could come in and dock there.
Yeah, I think also that makes me think of just the environmental protections, kind of like we were talking a little bit about in terms of our infrastructure and our resources, particularly Lake Michigan. The state of Indiana is actually ranked 49th in terms of environmental regulations.
Okay, we're way at the bottom of that list.
Yes, we are way at the bottom of a lot of lists, unfortunately. But a large part of that is that we have to have clean water if we're going to actually eat the
fish.
Yeah, exactly. and so that is certainly something that we need to start thinking about. A lot of the industrial industry has kind of taken up the majority of our lakefront property, and we need to seriously think about, and also polluted a lot of our lakefront or our lake. So I think we need to think about kind of how we want to invest in our infrastructure and our natural resources if we really care about the future of those
Renee,
resources.
the other side of that discussion.
You three women are the answer, and I hear how you're talking, and you talk in ways that other people don't. And there are hundreds of millions of dollars to remediate the land and the lakes, but no one has taken the attention to the time.
Well, that's what I was going to
You three are environmentally concerned, and I hope that you are help bring some of those hundreds of millions of dollars in here.
Well, thank you.
I'm enjoying you, ladies. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for that call, but I think the other side of that call is electing officials that are going to do what's best for your community. And I think that's what he was saying. Why do we treat each other so poorly? And we have these elected officials who may use money for one thing instead of the other. Rachel, I think you had some...
Well, I think, all of us are the answer. That's the place we have to start from. And looking at the Freedom Summer and SNCC, my sister was telling me one of her favorite things about SNCC is that when anybody from the organization was asked, who leads you, who's your leader, they would always respond to all of us.
We all
are. And it's because we all have a responsibility to be concerned about these issues and do whatever we can, because we really are our brother's keeper. We're all interconnected. Our future is intertwined with each other. If I'm doing well but someone else isn't, that's my problem too. So we have to start changing our attitude about, as long as I get ahead, it's okay, and if I'm living comfortably, it's okay. That's not true. If there's people out there suffering and they shouldn't be, and we can stop it, we have to work on those issues, especially if you have what you need. you have to be willing to sacrifice for people that you don't know. That's just the
that's a
reality
great
of our
take from
future.
that.
Yeah, and that makes me think of a couple of things. So, you know, strong people don't need strong leaders. That's something that Ella Baker always said. And really what that means, to your point, Reagan, is that you can't just elect someone to then go out and think that they're going to work in your best interest. Like, it might start on election day, but you have to hold people accountable. But you also have to understand that government is not going to solve all of our problems, and that a lot of what really where change come from is the outside of government and how we decide to actually organize and make things happen in our communities ourselves.
And I think the problem, though, is what our last caller just said. You know, there were $3 million allocated, or however many $1 million, and they were spent on one thing instead of maybe what the people of the community needed. And that's why, although Rachel's absolutely right, we have to work as a whole. We have to work together. We all must lead each other. We also have to make sure those people who have the ability to make those top level decisions, or those monetary and economic decisions, are making the ones that everybody wants. And so that's why both things are very important.
Yeah. Right, and that's why voters have to be informed. The first step is going to register to vote and actually showing up at the polls. Gary has a horrible voting rate. There's so many people
I think it's 12% right now.
Well, I think that's Lake County, but you know what a lot of people don't know is that Gary's turnout rate is typically the highest within Lake County. But I think you're both right in saying that we need to get people registered to vote, but we need to have active citizenry throughout the year, throughout the process.
And that's right, and that's the only way to hold people accountable and to elect people who are going to work in all of our best interests.
Okay, well, I think that we're coming near the end of the show, and as a wrap-up, I wanted to make sure that we were able to not only give the issues and the problems that are going on today, but also give a few solutions. And we were able to kind of talk about this. It's difficult to give solutions to such large and major problems, but I think that each of us may have something that we'd like to add at the end, just for people to kind of go out, think about, and move forward with through the week. And I'll just start off by saying that I think that everyone in this community, in every community that have industries that are failing, everybody needs to start trying to think about what can be our next industry. Is that environmental? Is it mechanical? Is it electrical? What is the new industry that we need to bring into our communities to start anew, start fresh? I've always talked about environmental. I've always talked about creating energy through wind and solar panels, and how that can not only help a community to reduce its costs, but also help the people. In Gary, Indiana, we have NIPSCO, which is in most of Lake County. In Chicago, they have ComEd. If there's no regulations right now that requires NIPSCO or ComEd to buy back electricity if citizens make it. I think that could be a great industry here in Gary, just because of the wind speeds that we have, and how that should be looked at by every citizen. Every citizen can go out and buy a $500 wind turbine, or make their own at home for less than $100 if they want. Just to start that process of saving energy, saving electricity, bringing down your NIPSCO bill, and hopefully starting the conversation within downstate to require that companies like NIPSCO buy back energy. So that would be my suggestion for the week, for people just to think about. I know it sounds a lot harder than it is, but just start thinking a bit differently about what we can do in the community. Renee?
Well, I would say probably three things, and I think we touched on a lot of different types of issues throughout this show alone. But typically, you know, a lot of times we're so removed from what's going on. I would say that I would almost recommend in every single situation, social issue, problem that we face, that there's three things individuals can do. And the first is to be informed and stay informed. And that in itself can be difficult, right? You need to know what's going on at the council, even if you cannot make it. And I understand why a lot of people cannot. You need to know what's going on in this country and know what's on the national level and the state. I think a large part of the problem, and hopefully we can kind of address this in the show, is what they do in Indianapolis at the State House that we don't even necessarily hear about. But so stay informed, and then the second thing is to join an organization that works on an issue you care about. There are so many organizations to join, and really do some research and join an organization you care about. And then the final thing would be to figure out what you're willing to give. what you're willing to give in actually addressing issues and problems, whether it's your talent, whether it's your donations, whatever that looks like. Really think about what you're willing to give. A lot of what we talked about was sacrifice, kind of with the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and the fact that people were willing to sacrifice their lives, their bodies, to change a lot of what they saw. So I would say to give that some serious thought, and to go out there and do the work.
Okay, Rachel?
Well, my number one thing is, especially since this is our first show, I really want to see people go out and exercise their right to vote. I just want people to get registered. I want people to vote. Like Renee says, that's her line. I stole it from her, but getting informed and staying informed, I think that is so important. And I know it is not, it's clearly not the total solution to all of our problems, but I think it's the first step. So please vote.
That's great. So we want to thank everybody for tuning in. This was our first show of the Hatcher Empowerment Factor. Next week, we're going to be discussing jobs, unemployment, and the new minimum wage and how that's going to affect us across the country. Until then, this is Reagan Hatcher, Renee Hatcher, and Rachel Hatcher signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Hatcher Empowerment Factor with Reagan, Rochelle, and Renee Hatcher. The views and opinions expressed on the Hatcher Empowerment Factor are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time on the Hatcher Empowerment Factor.